23 January 1945, Belgium. Revenge-minded Joes of the 7th Armored Division today launch a smashing frontal assault against the town of Saint-Vith. The unit was driven out of the town 2 weeks ago when the Nazis mounted their last-ditch offensive in the Ardennes. Now, as the pendulum of war swings back in favor of the Allies, they are taking it back from SS General Joseph Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army. Supported by elements of the 30th Infantry Division, the tankers roll into the town after a devastating artillery barrage. From the rubble, the remaining Germans offer a desperate counterattack. They fight like cornered beasts, inflicting heavy casualties upon the Americans. But unlike last month, the U.S. Army is the juggernaut now, and within hours, every last Nazi soldier in Saint-Vith is either dead or marched into captivity. Meanwhile, in a frantic fight for the villages of La Glaise and Monhaix, SS Colonel Joachim Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Division has its first encounter with the U.S. 30th Infantry Division, known as Roosevelt's SS, for the ruthless manner in which it fights. All too soon, the arrogant Peiper learns that the reputation is well-deserved. The Americans inflict grievous casualties upon his unit. Peiper watches helplessly as his supplies of fuel and ordnance expire at the height of the battle. Abandoning its heavy Tiger tanks and other equipment, Kampfgruppe Peiper flees back to Germany on foot. In the south, the ever-successful General George Patton commits his 5th Infantry Division to the fray, making a surprise crossing of the Oder River toward the town of Diekirch, Luxembourg. With their flank protected by the 4th Infantry Division, the veteran 5th soon begins pushing the enemy back. Again, the Germans, unable to get fuel and artillery rounds, cannot mount an effective defense against the steamrollering Americans. As the Americans re-establish their forward lines, 9 divisions of General Hasse von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army near Bastogne and 4 divisions of General Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army in the south are forced to fall back towards the German frontier. Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army is pulled from the front and sent east to stem the Russian advance. As dawn approaches on 28 January, Allied officials declare the Battle of the Bulge to be officially over. Not so the Battle of the Generals. The ever-sanctimonious British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proudly steps up to press microphones and declares that he has saved the proverbial American skin in the Ardennes. American generals, noting that he had never actually committed more than 1 British brigade to the fracas, are outraged. To make matters worse, Monty reiterates his suggestion that he be placed in command of all ground forces in the European theater. Montgomery has gone too far, Ike declares. It is time for one of them to go. Montgomery's chief of staff, catching wind of the situation, convinces his boss to retract the request, as clearly America is now the force behind the Allied war effort. A pouting and petulant Montgomery insists he meant no harm. Ultimately, it falls to no less a personage than Winston Churchill to smooth over the Americans' ruffled feathers. Outraged at Montgomery's stupidity, he declares from the floor of the House of Commons that the Battle of the Bulge is an American victory, destined to live forever in the history books. Evidence of this epic victory lies strewn about the Ardennes. The forest floor is littered with the corpses of more than 100,000 men of the Führer's Wehrmacht. In a fruitless attempt to split the Allies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace, Hitler has exhausted his troop reserves in the Stygian dark of this ancient wood. Their armies shattered, the Germans have been pushed back to the West Wall in just over a month. But the reversal has been hard won. Just 6 weeks ago, American soldiers talked happily under these trees of a white Christmas in the States. Now their frozen bodies are stacked like cordwood, waiting to be counted and sent to graves registration for burial. More than 81,000 sons of American mothers have paid the ultimate price to defend a piece of woods most had never even heard of, all because of one madman's desperate desire for self-preservation. 27 January 1945, Michino. In the mountains and jungles of North Burma, the engineering ordeal known as the Ledo Road is now complete. A crucial link from British-held India to the Burma Road, the 500-mile route is the only viable overland supply artery to the Chinese nationalists. This stretch of gravel has come at a terrible cost in human lives, both for the workers who blasted through rock to build it and the soldiers who blasted the Japanese out of the jungles. It has been said that the Ledo Road was laid down at the rate of a mile a day and cost a man a mile. But the mortality rate alone doesn't begin to describe their ordeal. A dark cloud of malaria, typhus, and other tropical diseases followed the caravan as it snaked through the godforsaken Burmese countryside. When the monsoons came, dumping up to 15 inches of rain a day, the jungles became infested with all manner of repulsive fauna, including omnipresent purple leeches. Soldiers slept in wet tents, worked in wet clothes, and slogged through wet earth without relief. If conditions became more than the workers could bear, Japanese snipers and fighter pilots were more than happy to put them out of their misery. Over 80% of the road was built over contested ground. As the engineers labored, Chinese and American troops fanned out ahead of them, beating the bushes for Japanese troops. Even as the first supply trucks pulled out of Ledo in late December, Chinese soldiers were desperately clearing the way. A convoy led by General Louis Pick slowly pushed off over the foreboding terrain, bound for Kunming, China, some 1,100 miles away. Steep grades slowed the group to a crawl, extending the trip into a month-long odyssey of fits and starts. Defying the equally steep odds they had been given in 1943 for completing a usable road, the convoy arrives intact. All the fighting in North Burma has led to this moment. Cut off since 1941 when the Japanese severed the Burma Road, Chinese troops under Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek have been holding on by their fingernails. The Allies now hope that an adequately supplied nationalist army will draw Japan's battered war machine away from fighting in the Pacific. The Ledo Road also means fewer deadly airlifts over the hump of the Himalayas. Generalissimo Chiang, presumably without irony, renames the Ledo to Kunming route the Stilwell Road shortly after it is opened. General Joseph Stilwell had been Chiang's chief of staff in the China-Burma-India theater until he was stripped of command for his lack of deference to the Asian leader. The imperative now is to wipe the hills and jungles clean of the enemy, free more troops for the conflict in China, and finally sweep the Japanese from the mainland. As part of Operation Capital, General Daniel Sultan, Stilwell's successor, launches an attempt to secure the Burma Road from the north and drive east to west toward Lashio. Witnessing a large supply drop to the American Mars task force, the Japanese mistakenly think they are under attack by paratroopers. Their misunderstanding is perhaps justified, as the Marsmen are part of a continuing Allied experiment in long-range penetration warfare. Starting with the British Chindits and the American Galahad Task Force, also known as Merrill's Marauders, the Allies have been deploying forces deep into Burma for some time, substituting air attacks and supply drops for traditional artillery support and supply lines. The results have been mixed, but encouraging enough to give it another go with the Mars Task Force. Equipped with few heavy weapons and driven by mule power, the Marsmen's task is to act as a catalyst for the larger Chinese forces in the area. The Chinese nationalists have often failed to fulfill their strategic responsibilities in Burma. Simple orders do not suffice for Chiang's forces, which are little more than a crazy quilt of smaller warlord armies. They need to be poked and prodded into action, often on the pretext of preserving their own honor. Sultan's hope is that successful American attacks on the Japanese 56th Division will force the Chinese to save face and commit 2 nearby divisions of their own to the fray. Believing they are under a large-scale airborne invasion, the Japanese retreat down the Burma Road and are continually harassed by Mars mortars and demolition teams. Unfortunately, the Chinese fail to finish off the Japanese troops, later claiming they expected the Marsmen to block the road completely. The first week of February is characterized by furious fighting as the Japanese division beats a hasty southern retreat, stopping often to buy time with short, furious counterattacks. Enemy artillery barrages are met with Allied air raids. Soon the Mars Task Force faces only minor skirmishes with the tail end of the departing Japanese forces. When the Chinese finally link up with the Americans at the Burma Road, the enemy has retired well to the south. But the failure to destroy the enemy cannot overshadow the stunning accomplishment of reopening the land route to China. Now that supplies can flow freely into the theater, the sun is beginning to set on the Emperor's Chinese adventure. Look closely. Those aren't GIs in training, they're nurses. Some of the more than 75,000 women who serve in the Army and Navy Nurse Corps. Although both service organizations were established in the first decade of this century, it has been only in the last 3 years that they have matured into indispensable professional service corps. Medics remove wounded troops from the battlefield and take them to field evacuation hospitals. Using a new technique called triage, doctors and nurses determine who can wait for treatment and who cannot. They diagnose the extent of a soldier's wound and prioritize it according to a common schedule of levels of required care. Men who are unstable or critically wounded receive immediate treatment. Those who can withstand travel are relocated to evacuation hospitals just a few miles away. From evacuation hospitals, men may be transported to station hospitals even further from the front, and from there to semi-permanent general hospitals. Today, the time between the battlefield and treatment is usually a matter of hours rather than days. Quick treatment, new drugs, and highly skilled medical personnel make the difference between this and past wars, and between life and death. Nurses provide an important link in the medical evacuation chain. They bear the brunt of the responsibility for setting up and maintaining the various hospitals along the way. They scrub and disinfect walls and floors in vacant buildings they must turn into hospitals. They pack and unpack hospital tents and procure medical supplies, scavenging if they have to. But they do more. They are not menial laborers. Whether they serve at the front, on hospital trains or ships, or at more permanent hospitals away from the fighting, they assist doctors in surgery, administer anesthesia, give blood transfusions, provide physical therapy, and treat the emotionally injured. Evacuation flights that whisk the wounded from one facility to another often carry only one nurse. These Florence Nightingales of the air, with only one medical corpsman to share the duty, can be charged with the safety and comfort of as many as 25 patients. And they do so under a greater threat of enemy fire than their peers at the front. Since the transport planes that evacuate the wounded also double as cargo planes, they are not protected from enemy fire under the Geneva Convention. Who is today's military nurse? She is patriotic, duty-bound, and adventuresome. She is a highly skilled medical professional able to treat injury and trauma unlike any she would have encountered in peacetime, and deal with such exotic and unfamiliar diseases as malaria, dysentery, and trench foot. Nurses distinguished themselves at Pearl Harbor on that horrible day of infamy, and on Bataan when the Japanese marched in and took prisoners. They landed in North Africa with the Allied invasion force, distinguishable from their brothers in arms only by their Red Cross armbands and their lack of weapons. When the enemy doesn't acknowledge the neutrality that a Red Cross signifies, nurses pay the price. Nurses have lived and worked under rugged, dangerous, and frightening conditions for more than 3 years. They have sustained enemy shelling and bombing, dug foxholes and taken shelter in them, and been trapped for months behind enemy lines. Some are spending the war in enemy prison camps. Others have died in the line of duty. Are they weary of battle? Yes, but they won't tell you they are. For despite the inherent danger in their jobs, their responsibility to their patients, the battle casualties of this war, the sick and the injured, always comes first. January 1945, Pomerania. As the Russian war machine pounds across Poland like a steel-clad hydra, the woefully outnumbered German forces lose ground at an alarming rate. Stalin's tanks advance on 4 separate fronts, and the once fearsome Wehrmacht scrambles to avoid annihilation. This series of withdrawals and defeats infuriates Hitler, who responds by stripping officers of their medals, their commands, and, in some cases, their freedom. Generals with the common sense to order a retreat find themselves behind bars. The less fortunate officers, those still in command, must now clear every decision with Berlin. Soon, frontline commanders are in a state of desperation as the Second Belarusian Front, led by Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, smashes the German Second Army, kicking open the door to the heart of the fatherland. It's obvious to Hitler's beleaguered Chief of Staff, General Heinz Guderian, that the hole must be plugged. At Guderian's urging, Hitler creates Army Group Vistula to guard the German frontier in Pomerania and buttress the decimated Army Group A. What this critical command requires is a wily, battle-hardened officer. What it gets is Bavarian chicken farmer Heinrich Himmler, who has already proven himself incompetent as the commander of Western Front forces on the Upper Rhine. Frustrated with the practicality of his career officers, Hitler now hopes a Nazi true believer will gleefully drive his troops into the Soviet meat grinder. It is perhaps appropriate that Himmler should command the group, as it is largely composed of the shoddy Volkssturm units he helped to create. The Volkssturm represent the last desperate scrapings of the Wehrmacht's manpower reserves. They are young boys and old men, with little training and scrounged weaponry. Himmler's initial moves include evacuating strategic outposts along the rivers and attacking an empty town. Undaunted by the foul-ups, Hitler decides to launch Operation Solstice, an assault on Marshal Zhukov's forces from Himmler's northern position. Of course, the Fuhrer wants his longtime Nazi compatriot to lead the drive, but wiser heads prevail. Guderian positions the seasoned General Walter Wenck as commander by proxy of the operation. Meanwhile, Himmler checks himself into a sanitarium but maintains nominal control over his troops. Solstice is a doomed venture, regardless of who leads it. The counterattack is confounded from the start by impassable roads, sparse air support, and dwindling supplies. To make matters worse, General Wenck is seriously injured while driving to the front, forcing Himmler from his bed and back to the front. The return of Hitler's hand-picked semi-invalid speeds the demise of the army group. For the Russians, Operation Solstice amounts to little more than a speed bump on the road to Berlin. The Red Army continues to move as fast as its supply line will allow, streaking across the Polish countryside to the German frontier. In short measure, the troops of Zhukov's First Belarusian Front reach the Oder River at Dresden. Although other Soviet units have reached the Oder at several places along its length, gaining Dresden has special implications. Here, the Soviets are less than 50 miles from Berlin and Hitler's lair. In the south, where the Oder bends toward the east, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front has broken out of their bridgeheads on the Vistula and made spectacular gains. As with General Patton and Field Marshal Montgomery in the west, intense rivalry also exists among the Russian commanders. Although Zhukov has the most direct line of advance to the German capital, his bridgeheads and supply lines are both tenuous. Additionally, he can expect the bulk of the German defenses in his path. Konev knows this. Although he too will suffer from supply problems, he also knows that the Neisse River sector assigned to him affords a much better opportunity for both fording and maneuver. Thus, he spurs his command forward, encircling the Silesian capital of Breslau. The capture of Berlin is the final glory in a war already won. Konev's strategy is to cross the Neisse, roll up the German flank and drive for Berlin, ahead of Zhukov. But Konev meets stiff opposition both from the German defenders in his path and from the Soviet High Command. He is forced to halt his drive on the Neisse, pull even with Zhukov, and mop up the bypassed Germans. Neither potential conqueror of Berlin will start with an unfair advantage. Despite the retrograde actions of commanders and the heroics of individual soldiers, the overwhelming tide of Soviet men and materiel simply crush any attempt at organized resistance. The 70 divisions destroyed in whole or part represent the latest sacrifice on the altar of Hitler's fanaticism. The forces of outraged humanity are closing vice-like on the lair of mankind's greatest evil. The instrument of Hitler's reckoning lies less than an hour's Autobahn drive away, to the east. February 1945, Dresden. For generations, this quiet city of church spires and cobbled streets has been known for its china, its art masterpieces, and its architecture. With little industry and no troop concentrations, it has been spared the devastating consequences of Adolf Hitler's doomed bid for world domination, while the terrible force of the Allies' strategic bombing campaign has turned most of Germany's cities into rubble. With the war now all but over, there is no reason to believe enemy bombers will strike at Dresden, and that has made it a mecca for hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing Red Army offensives in Prussia to the north and Silesia to the east. Soviet troops are now only 80 miles away, and the city's population has mushroomed from 680,000 to well over 1 million. Housing and other facilities are strained, but residents and refugees alike are thankful to be living in what they believe is an open city. Civil defense measures common in other cities long have been neglected here. No huge concrete and steel public air raid bunkers have been built. There are very few alternate sources of water and electrical power. Many of the existing bomb shelters are not properly ventilated. Few residents know what to do in the event of an attack. As the people of Dresden settle in for the night, British Lancaster bombers loaded with a combination of high-explosive bombs and incendiary devices are headed their way. Their mission, codenamed Thunderclap, is the carpet bombing of Dresden. It is designed to achieve maximum destruction of the city's interior on a scale so far unseen in this or any war. The master bomber responsible for overseeing the operation reaches Dresden at about 10 p.m. ahead of the air armada. He will stay over the target throughout the raid, directing successive bomb runs. He is joined soon by the marker planes, which drop flares to highlight the stadium that will be the center of the target area. Anxiously, they watch for Nazi fighters or flak, but the night skies over Dresden are clear. Satisfied that Dresden is completely undefended, the master bomber orders his pilots to approach the city below the cloud cover. As they make their runs, there is nothing to stop or even distract them. Their bombs find their targets with impressive accuracy. In Dresden, the high explosive bombs create mountains of debris, fuel for the incendiary devices that follow. The shock waves knock out windows and smash roofs. Sparks from the first fires blow into other buildings, igniting anything flammable. One by one, the many smaller fires begin to come together in a single, horrific conflagration. German firefighters wage a desperate battle as air raid sirens signal the approach of a second wave of 529 bombers. As they approach, the second group of British airmen sees a brilliant scarlet and white glow in the sky. Visible from miles away, the fiery aura of the burning city guides the planes directly to Dresden. One airman estimates that sea of fire covers 40 square miles. Another is reminded of the warnings of evangelists in gospel meetings. For those on the ground, it must now seem that hell is opened to swallow them. Smoke blankets the area. Sparks are flying everywhere. The clothes of those fleeing start to smolder, then ignite. People are sucked, screaming, into the flames. Others simply fall noiselessly to the ground as they run, overcome by carbon monoxide poisoning. Even the city's air raid shelters offer no refuge from the inferno. Many are inadequate and poorly ventilated. The heat, which approaches 1,000 degrees centigrade, turns some into ovens, literally baking those inside. Dawn on Ash Wednesday finds fires still burning in many areas as Dresden's devastated survivors pick their way through a desolate moonscape. But there is yet another chapter in Dresden's tale of horror. Just past noon, a third wave of more than 1,300 American B-17s and Liberator bombers appears. Dropping thousands of bombs through the obscuring smoke, they pulverize what is left of the tortured city. Finally, there is quiet, and those left alive begin digging for the dead. In 14 hours, more than 2,300 Allied planes have dropped 4,700 tons of bombs on Dresden, including 600,000 incendiary devices. 3,000 acres in the center of Dresden are completely leveled. The death toll from this bombing raid is the largest of any in the war. Some estimates run as high as 130,000, almost all of them civilians. This would be more than double the number of British civilians killed in German air raids in the war to date. And still, the question lingers, why? Why this raid against this target at this time? It was well known that the city was brimful of civilian refugees, and that at least 26,000 Allied prisoners of war were held there. As Dresden was of little strategic importance to the Reich, it is possible this raid had less to do with the outcome of the war than with what will come after. Perhaps it was a message to the huge and powerful Red Army, a message that the Americans and the British still have great power of their own. For February 1945, Manila. Allied forces are taking a crash course in urban warfare as elements of the 6th and 8th Armies move in to encircle the city. During December and January, Japan strengthened its defenses in Manila with some 4,000 new troops, turning the city and its environs into a veritable stockade. Building entrances have been entrenched with sandbags, tunnels have been dug between the basements of buildings, and streets have been blocked with barbed wire. Hastily adapting from jungle fighting to street fighting, American GIs force their way into the city and free 3,700 American prisoners at Santo Tomas University. Beneath bursts of vicious machine gun fire, Americans storm the old Bilibad prison, liberating hundreds of Allied prisoners of war and more than 500 civilians. Other American units begin clearing Japanese resistance from residential areas of the city in a bloody struggle that reduces entire urban blocks to piles of smoking rubble. Despite orders from General Tomoyuki Yamashita declaring Manila an open city, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi vows to defend the city to the death. Disorder and lawlessness spread like a contagion from the top down, as Filipino citizens suffer the brutality of Japanese troops, enraged by imminent defeat. On 5 February, the Japanese blow up supplies and operations in Manila's North Port area. In an effort to keep the flames from spreading to the city's residential areas, American troops spent nearly a full day destroying frame buildings in the path of the fire. Anticipating that the Japanese planned similar demolitions to Manila's utility systems, other U.S. units scrambled to secure the city's water supply facilities and electrical power installations. Now the going is slow and treacherous for the airborne troops of the 11th Corps as they move northward into Manila and begin rooting out the enemy house by house and pillbox by pillbox. These maneuvers add to the city's devastation as mortar shells and demolitions blast through the walls of once peaceful homes and businesses. Flamethrowers transform neighborhoods into hellish infernos. Burning Japanese soldiers run screaming from the wildly shifting vortices of fire and death. As the 1st Cavalry presses forward to capture water supply facilities on the outskirts of the city, they stumble into another messy street battle. The Japanese have heavily mined the streets within New Manila and turned many homes into machine gun nests. The minefields halt the advance of American tanks and render them useless, leaving soldiers to rush recklessly from one strong point to another to gain ground. Troops clean out the rest of the suburban area northeast and east of the city during the next few days, claiming 350 Japanese casualties and a sizable cache of weapons. As the battle in Manila rages, the Japanese still hold tight to Nichols Field and the Cavity Naval Base. An American attack on the airfield is almost aborted after a withering encounter with artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire from Japanese defenses. But on 10 February, Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold takes control of the 11th Airborne and secures the southeast corner and the southern runway of Nichols Field. After a Marine airstrike knocks out many Japanese artillery positions, Griswold's airborne troops overrun most of the field and finish mopping up the next day. On 12 February, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division advanced to the shores of Manila Bay to complete the Allied encirclement of the city and its Japanese defenders. General Yamashita's troops, now isolated in the surrounding mountains, can choose only between surrender and a fight to the death. February 1945, Reichswald Forest. Just before dawn, the German 84th Division gets the worst kind of wake-up call, a 1,400-gun salute from Canadian artillery. They wake up in time to die. General Henry Crayar's big guns set the stage for Operation Veritable, the first step in the final Allied push to the Rhine. The British Second Army and the Canadian First Army position themselves to swoop down on Wesel from the northwest, hoping to link up at the Rhine with the U.S. Ninth Army. For the plan to work, the Allies have to gain control of downstream dams on the Ruhr River, which the Germans used to flood the valley. General Omar Bradley had dispatched the U.S. First Army to capture the dams and close the floodgates. After several days of fighting, Bradley's forces wrested control of the dams from enemy hands, but discovered the Germans had sabotaged the spillways. South of the Ruhr, the Ninth Army had been set to launch Operation Grenade simultaneously with Veritable, but that is now a logistical impossibility. The valley remains an impassable mud pit, and the Ruhr is too high to bridge. The GIs are forced to sit and wait. To the north, however, the die has been cast. The combined forces of Veritable have blasted a hole in the German 84th, allowing Allied infantrymen to plow forward. Ahead of them lies the dense reaches of Reichswald Forest, with its countless landmines, sloppy ground, and desperate German defenders. The Allies weren't expecting Hansel and Gretel, but they are surprised by the ferocity of German resistance. The enemy is no longer fighting for Aryan living space, but for his own backyard. For their part, German commanders were not expecting Monty's forces to attack over such daunting terrain. General Alfred Schlemm is the exception. His unit of paratroopers throws everything it has into the battle, taking advantage of deployment missteps by the newly integrated Veritable forces. Because the Ninth Army is bogged down in the muck, the German High Command can divert a healthy share of its scant resources to repel the British and Canadians. One by one, Schlemm moves supplemental forces into Reichswald, bitterly contesting every inch of territory. The tiny villages that dot the forest become fortresses for crack divisions of paratroopers. Despite the suffering of his Veritable forces, the redeployment of Nazi troops is encouraging to Montgomery. As Germany's finest meet the northern attack, the Americans are waiting impatiently on the banks of the Ruhr, sharpening their bayonets. The Nazis have turned their backs on these GIs and on the slowly receding river holding them at bay. Now, Montgomery is ready to pull the pin on Operation Grenade. 12 February 1945. After 10 days of peace talks, Greece finally seals the lid on its savage civil war between communist guerrillas and the loyal monarchists who are supported by 50,000 British soldiers. Though the Nazis pulled out in October 1944, the country has remained awash in strife for nearly 4 months. Greece's dauntless communist guerrillas, instrumental in the campaign against the Nazis, were devastated when their long-awaited liberation came not from the armies of the communist Soviet Union, but from the imperialistic-minded British. Throughout the European theater, communist citizens have played a disproportionately large role in guerrilla campaigns against the Nazis. From Belgium to Yugoslavia, these ragtag shadow armies have been instrumental in disrupting and distracting the German war machine. Unwilling to bow to their Axis conquerors, normal citizens have formed pockets of resistance. They have fled the cities and found refuge in mountains and forests. Hopelessly outnumbered, they cannot engage their enemy in traditional face-to-face confrontation. Instead, they have waged campaigns of guerrilla warfare, sabotaging rail lines, destroying communications, and ambushing patrols. These men and women patriots may be without uniforms, but they are soldiers nonetheless. Just 11 days after the Nazi invasion of Yugoslavia, the government fled and an armistice was signed. The invasion cost only 151 German lives. The low number of casualties and a similarly rapid, low-cost occupation of Greece left Adolf Hitler anything but impressed by the Balkan fighting spirit. In preparation for his invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler pulled the majority of his troops from Yugoslavia, leaving behind only 4 battle-weary divisions. Der Führer's analysis of the resolve of the Balkan people would prove to be a gross underestimation. Had he studied but a little of the area's history, Hitler would have learned that the question was not if the Balkan people would resist, but rather when. Action began immediately after the German pullout. Using the naturally rugged terrain to their advantage, the fiercely patriotic guerrillas carefully picked their battlegrounds and initiated small skirmishes, bringing combat to a more personal level than panzers and artillery normally allow. Out of this ragtag army, a leader emerges, Josef Broz, known as Tito. Devoted to communism and Mother Russia, Tito is determined to do all he can to ease the strain on the Soviets in the Eastern Front. His highly aggressive and daring army of partisans, named after the bands of Spanish guerrillas who fought Napoleon, engaged in textbook shadow warfare. They laid their ambushes at mountain passes and coastal roadways, striking quickly and retreating into the landscape. To the Germans, they were everywhere and nowhere at once. Just 5 months after Hitler had withdrawn from Yugoslavia, Tito realized his objective. German reinforcements were called back, including a full division from the Russian front. The Nazis slammed the rebels with everything they had, overpowering the partisans with armor, artillery, and air power. Tito quickly called for a retreat, and his army vanished into the mountainous Sandjak region on the Serbian border, where the German heavy weapons couldn't follow. Failing time and again to find a final solution to the Yugoslavian problem, Hitler launched 7 separate operations, each larger than the previous, each with more men, machines, and supplies which were desperately needed in other arenas. But Yugoslavia was too large for the Nazis to be everywhere at once, and the geography worked against them. There was always somewhere for Tito and his men to hide. In October 1944, an enraged and frustrated Hitler had 14 divisions and more than 140,000 men bogged down in an enervating occupation of Yugoslavia, when Tito, acting as president and as marshal of an 800,000-man partisan army, returned to Belgrade with the support of the Soviets and drove the Germans from the city. In Greece, a group of communist partisans known as Ilas also attracted the attention of the Allies. The Brits, though wary of supporting the radical communists, still gave their assistance. Ilas was killing the most Nazis. The group would eventually control more than 50% of Greece. In 1943, an attempt to trick the Germans into believing an invasion of Greece was imminent, 3 weeks of massive guerrilla activity was mounted. The objective was to keep the German High Command ignorant of the real Allied invasion point, Sicily. While Allied commanders considered the operation an overwhelming success, the guerrillas, never told the true purpose of their missions, were upset that no Allied landing force ever arrived. Nevertheless, the call for uprising was heard by citizens all over occupied Europe, and as the eventual arrival of an Allied Liberation Army became more and more imminent, the guerrillas' numbers rose. In France, the well-organized Maquis helped prepare for the massive Normandy invasion and actually kept 2 German divisions from the beaches. Belgium, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Italy each also produced its own unique guerrilla movement. It is difficult to measure the impact of the guerrillas. While no credit for the tide of Allied victory can be usurped from the men in uniform, there is no doubt that the guerrillas have played an important strategic role. Their constant harassment and sabotage have placed an incalculable burden on the Germans, delaying the arrival of supplies, disrupting communication, demanding the attention of armed forces, and diverting complete concentration on the invading troops. Adolf Hitler and the Nazis now know that defeating an army is one thing, defeating a nation is quite another. 11 February 1945, Yalta. From Casablanca to Quebec, Washington, D.C. to Tehran, at points all over the globe, the leaders of the Allied powers have met throughout the course of this war to plot the destruction of Nazi tyranny in Europe. Now, with victory seemingly at hand, they meet in the Crimean city of Yalta at the former summer palace of Tsar Nicholas. Here the endgame begins in earnest. Three men, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and an ailing Franklin Roosevelt, will plot the course of the post-war world. Less united in the cause of peace than in war, each man brings his own agenda to Yalta, and each clings tenaciously to the points he considers most important. Throughout the conference, Roosevelt and Churchill focus less on seeking revenge against Germany and more on a lasting peace and a free Europe. Stalin, on the other hand, is not one to forget past transgressions. Indeed, Russia has borne a disproportionate share of suffering at the hands of Hitler's minions. He demands punishment and retribution against the Nazi state. After 7 days of intense debate, long hours of negotiation, and much give and take, the Big Three present their agreement to the world, a world that will forever be altered by the words it contains. Under the Yalta Agreement, England, the United States, and the Soviet Union pledged to help the nations liberated from Nazi domination destroy the last vestiges of Nazism and fascism, and to create democratic institutions of their own choosing. It is a high ideal, to be sure, but how it translates to fact on the ground, particularly in the East, remains to be seen. In Poland, despite vowing he will allow free and unfettered elections, Stalin already has begun to establish a communist regime to ensure that the Soviets have a strong Western neighbor that can prevent any future German incursion against Mother Russia. Stalin need not worry about Germany, however. The Yalta Agreement leaves it a hollow shell of a country controlled by the Big Three and France. The agreement gives each of the Allied nations its own zone of occupation. In addition, Germany must pay for losses she has caused the Allies in the course of the war. The bulk of these reparations will go to the countries that have borne the main burden of the war, have suffered the heaviest losses, and have organized Germany's defeat. Stalin is pleased with the reparations arrangement, as he is with the redistribution of territory, both in Europe and in Asia. Throughout history, post-war maps have differed, often dramatically, from their pre-war counterparts. To Uncle Joe's delight, the post-World War II map of Europe will be no exception. After the war, Poland will no longer occupy the same coordinates that it now does. At Stalin's demand, the Yalta Agreement redraws the nation's boundaries, adding enough German land to her western frontier to make up for what Russia has grabbed from her eastern border. The Soviet Union also will receive several pieces of prime Far East real estate that Stalin has been eyeing, thereby righting the so-called wrongs committed by Japan in the 1904 war between the two nations. It is probable that history will judge Stalin to be the ultimate victor at Yalta. He seems to have come away from the table with most of his demands met. But for every Soviet victory, every US and British concession, FDR and Churchill have won a point of their own. Churchill has secured distribution of power in Europe by bringing France into the occupation force, even if he and FDR had to give up parts of their own zones to do so. FDR has elicited promises of support for a United Nations organization dedicated to preserving the peace, and a first meeting of member nations on 25 April in San Francisco. He has also received Stalin's word that within 2 to 3 months of victory in Europe, the Red Army will join the US and Britain in their fight against Japan. Without the Soviets' help, FDR's advisors tell him the Pacific War will last another 18 months and cost 1 million additional lives. Still, FDR has detractors at home. They say that he played fast and loose with Poland's fate, that he has been duped by Uncle Joe into making too many concessions to the Soviets, that the agreement has no means to make Stalin keep his promises. With the question of FDR's health still lingering, the most often heard criticism is that he is just too ill to have been entrusted with such a responsibility. It is likely, however, that both FDR and Churchill have made the best deal they could under the circumstances. While U.S. troops have been bogged down in the Bulge, Stalin's army has been on the move throughout Eastern Europe. The Red Army has driven the Nazis out of Yugoslavia, liberated Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, penetrated Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, and is poised to enter Berlin. To remove the Soviets from Eastern Europe and deny Stalin an upper hand in Poland would mean more war, more death, more destruction. Neither the British nor the American people or their armies will tolerate much more. As Ben Franklin once said, necessity never made a good bargain. February 1945, the Philippines. Corregidor is but a barren, war-worn rock, hallowed as so many places by death and disaster. Yet it symbolizes within itself that priceless, deathless thing, the honor of a nation. Until we lift our flag from its dust, we stand unredeemed before mankind. Some 3 years after General Douglas MacArthur delivered these words, American forces are prepared to reclaim the United States' former headquarters in the Pacific. Seizing the rocky outpost at the entrance to Manila Bay will allow Allied ships to move freely and pinch off another supply route for the Japanese. But because it was the site of his ouster from the Philippines in 1942, recapturing Corregidor may have a deeper, more personal meaning for MacArthur. After days of heavy air and sea bombardment, the island fortress is ripe for an all-out attack. Shortly after dawn, in an effort to catch the Japanese off guard, C-47 Goonie Birds drop a regimental combat team of paratroopers from the 11th Airborne Division on Corregidor. Theirs is a dangerous mission. If Japanese marksmen don't shoot them out from under their silks, the stiff and ever-shifting Pacific winds threaten to carry large numbers of the paratroops to a watery grave. To lessen their time in the air and keep them from becoming floating targets for Japanese snipers, the airborne troops are dropped at an altitude far lower than any yet attempted during the war. With only 6 seconds in the air, the men in the first wave have almost no time to stabilize themselves for landing. As jumpers crash into buildings and debris or miss the zone completely, the casualty rate from the initial drop exceeds the 20% estimate of the assault's planners. The paratroops' target is topside, an elevated flat beyond Malinta Hill in Corregidor's midsection, which is heavily defended by the Japanese. On topside's 3 faces, the land shears away into steep cliffs above the sea. From here, the defenders could make mincemeat out of infantry, who will soon be coming ashore on the island's sandy beaches. But surprise does indeed have its rewards. Japanese defenders expected an amphibious landing, but apparently they never dreamed the American generals would be crazy enough to try an airborne assault on topside. The desperately scrambling defenders suffer a crushing blow in the first moments of attack. Drifting paratroopers accidentally land in the midst of a Japanese observation post on the cliffs. In a sudden, vicious exchange of fire, the Yanks kill the commander of the Japanese garrison along with his aides. Offshore, a contingent of cruisers and destroyers lets loose a furious barrage. This pounding is followed by bombardment from waves of Allied planes. Meanwhile, Colonel George Jones' Rock Force plows through Manila Bay toward Black Beach, a 200-yard strip on the south shore of Corregidor. 2 hours after the first paratroopers hit, 6th Army infantry begin to pour onto the beaches from landing crafts. Covering fire from the American paratroopers on topside pins the Japanese troops underground, and the first 4 waves come ashore virtually unopposed. By the time the 5th wave approaches with its complement of vehicles and heavy equipment, mines on the beach begin detonating. Still, to this point, real resistance is light, and by the time Jones's troops have taken Malinta Hill, they have lost only 2 men killed and 6 wounded. As the day wears on, however, American troops realize that they are greatly outnumbered on Corregidor. The Japanese have taken refuge from the massive air and naval bombardment in the maze of tunnels, pillboxes, and ammunition magazines that catacomb the island. Stunned defenders fight back stubbornly from their scattered caves, bunkers, and tunnels with little or no direction, and must now be rooted out of their hiding places underground. A seemingly endless series of banzai charges saps the Americans' emotional and physical strength. Casualties mount as the troops push grimly forward. Shortly after midnight, the Japanese attempt to regain Malinta Hill. Hunkered in foxholes or any small depression they can find, the Americans are subjected to an intense artillery and mortar barrage that leaves them reeling. Despite this, they rise up to meet the enemy face to face in a vicious fight. For an hour and a half, the battle rages with casualties piling up on both sides. As the assault drags on through a second hellish day, the Emperor's men refuse to loosen their grip on the island. 16 American fighter planes are shot down, trying to give cover to advancing ground troops. Additional U.S. troops stream onto the island. The Japanese, however, refuse to yield. Isolated standoffs occur throughout the day and into the night, leaving Allied forces exhausted and considerably diminished in strength. It is clear that the quick victory MacArthur and Jones had hoped for is not to be. In the light of day, the Americans are supreme, but when night falls and air support vanishes, the Japanese are in their element, forcing the GIs to pull back into easily defendable perimeters. The give and take seems certain to continue for some time, and once again this tiny, war-torn rock is the site of a pivotal battle between two determined foes. One is fighting for mere survival, the other for national honor. January 1945, eastern France. A German bridgehead near Colmar threatens the American southern flank, and with it, General Eisenhower's plan for a broad and secure crossing of the Rhine River. One of the last holdouts of German dominance west of the Rhine, this stronghold of the Nazi 19th Army is known among the Allies as the Colmar Pocket. Long ago, recognizing the pocket's strategic importance, Eisenhower ordered 6th Army General Devers to make its eradication a top priority. The Supreme Commander hoped its capture would set up a knockout blow to German industry in the Ruhr Valley and an all-out push to Berlin. No one recognizes the logic behind Eisenhower's strategy better than Adolf Hitler. The Führer has ordered the Colmar bridgehead held at all costs. The assault on Colmar begins with the African colonial troops of General de Lattre de Tassigny's French First Army leading the way. Attacking from the south, their initial progress is slow. In addition to vicious resistance and expertly laid minefields, a blistering snowstorm blinds artillery spotters and causes innumerable problems for the French African troops, who are unaccustomed to the frigid, wintry conditions. The Germans seize the opportunity and counterattack. The commander of the French First Corps asked to postpone further operations until the snowstorm subsides. De Tassigny refuses as he plans to launch his Second Corps from the north the following day. Any pause in First Corps' advance would allow the Nazis to focus all their might on the northern force. First Corps continues its tortured advance, and on 23 January, Second Corps easily achieves its objective, pushing well into the enemy's northern flank. But just as the Germans begin to show signs of vulnerability, a rapid surge in temperature melts the snow and inundates the area. Amid the flooding, the French Sherman tanks and M10 tank destroyers, superior in number but inferior in capability, become even less useful. Meanwhile, German Panthers and Jagdpanther tank destroyers, outfitted with wide tracks designed for severe weather, freely maneuver and demolish the French tanks grounded in the muddy Colmar quagmire. On 27 January, the U.S. 3rd Division joins the fray, breaking the German defenses and moving to the Colmar Canal. The German High Command recognizing the bleakness of the situation, calls for a partial retreat across the Rhine. The Germans are reeling, and Eisenhower is determined to deliver the knockout punch. He orders the entire 21st Corps to reinforce Colmar, bringing the number of Allied troops involved in the campaign to 400,000. On 30 January, following a ferocious artillery barrage of more than 16,000 shells, the American and French forces surrounding the Germans simultaneously flood into the pocket. The U.S. 3rd Division crosses the Colmar Canal, while the 28th Division storms the city's suburbs. With victory assured, the Americans continue with simple housekeeping duties. Hitler has lost Colmar, and his generals warn that he will lose even more of his 19th Army if he doesn't order a retreat. Begrudgingly, the Fuhrer complies and authorizes a complete pullback across the Rhine. On 9 February, the retreating 19th, licking its wounds, marches back into Germany and drops the Chalons Bridge behind them. Although they leave 22,000 POWs behind, 50,000 Germans manage to escape the carnage of Colmar, back across the Rhine. Many of those, however, wonder if their comrades in Allied POW camps aren't the lucky ones. Faced with a vengeful, bloodthirsty foe advancing from the east, resting comfortably on a Nebraska farm suddenly seems rather appealing. February 1945, Burma. In the green hell of the Burmese jungle, British troops prepare a bloody surprise for the Imperial Japanese Army. While General William Slim's 4th Corps creeps south under radio silence toward the city of Mektela, a dummy HQ to the north receives bogus orders from the British High Command to move on Mandalay. The Japanese Burma Area Army has been listening in and anticipates a massive attack on the region's major prize, Mandalay. So when the 19th Indian Division dashed across the Irrawaddy River north of that city, Burma Area Army was ready. 2 divisions of Japanese went up against what was assumed to be the spear edge of the British 4th Corps. Precious time has been ticking away for the Japanese ever since, as the Indian soldiers repelled wave after wave of enemy troops. On 21 February, another offensive thrust, this time by the British 33rd Corps, threatens Mandalay. This reinforces the Japanese belief that the ancient city is the focus of the impending Allied offensive. Imperial commanders continue to mass their forces in the area. The Japanese are so convinced by the ruse that when the main attack finally does come west of Mektela, they at first dismiss it as a diversion. After the British 7th Division secures a bridgehead over the Irrawaddy near Mektela, the 17th Indian Division breaks out toward the city across the wide-open valley that separates it from the river. Unlike much of the Burma campaign, fought in dense jungle and treacherous mountains, tanks are out in front, leading the charge. The Allies also enjoy complete air superiority in the region. The few Japanese units standing between the river and the city are simply blasted out of the way. It seems nothing can go right for the Japanese High Command. Their early strategic mistakes are compounded by miscommunication, such as a garbled message that warns of 200 Allied vehicles rather than 2,000 on their way to Mektela. Only when the 17th Division approaches the city do the Japanese realize the severity of their blunder. Mektela is not only a target of opportunity, but also a vital rail link in the supply line between Rangoon and northern Burma. General Slim is hoping to choke off that lifeline, avoiding a long and costly battle for Mandalay. The veteran Indian Division makes short work of Mektela's Japanese garrison, made up almost entirely of administrative and service troops. Though they prove just as eager to die as their battle-hardened counterparts in the jungles, they are no match for Slim's men. Indian riflemen move from street to street, engaged in the all-too-familiar task of rooting out an intransigent enemy. Despite a stubborn fight, the outcome is never really in doubt. Then it is the Allies' turn to dig in as enemy troops swarm south from Mandalay to attack Mektela. General Honda's 33rd Army lays siege to the city for several weeks, throwing everything it has at the lone Indian division. The Allies hold firm, thanks in part to a steady flow of airdropped supplies. Paradoxically, Honda's troops have the 17th surrounded, but it is the Allies who hold the strategic advantage. Rail cars with Japanese reinforcements and supplies must pass through the city, and the Allies control it. The Imperial Army has played into General Slim's hands. Not only did they leave Mektela vulnerable to a quick assault, the redirection of Honda's troops has opened the door to an attack on Mandalay. The tide of war in central Burma has not simply turned. It threatens to sweep the Emperor's forces into oblivion.